I am 68 years old, and my name is Anita Shepherd. I live alone in a quiet, four-bedroom house that my late husband and I paid off a decade ago. I keep a tidy garden, pay my bills on time, and value my peace above all else. But the night my son tried to claim my house, he arrived with a moving truck, a residency agreement, and the absolute confidence of a man who believed my answer no longer mattered. The rain hammered the roof as the massive U-Haul backed into my driveway. Crushing my front lawn, David stomped onto the porch. Behind him, his wife Sarah crossed her arms, shivering but wearing a deeply entitled scowl. David didn't bother knocking. He shoved a damp document beneath my front door, rattled the handle, and pounded his fist against the wood. I stood in the entryway, watching the piece of paper slide across the hardwood floor. When I opened the door, keeping the heavy security chain firmly engaged, David leaned into the gap. "You have plenty of room," he announced, wiping rain from his forehead. "I'm moving in." He expected me to step aside. He expected the sight of his soaked clothes to override my common sense. My son lost $580,000 gambling, then came to my house with a residency agreement as if it already belonged to him. I looked at him, then at Sarah, who was already tapping her foot, impatient to take over my living room. I placed my hand flat against the doorframe, blocking any possibility of entry. "Not tonight," I answered, my voice barely louder than the storm. David blinked, confused. He tried to push his weight against the wood. I shoved the door back with a sharp, heavy thud. Not ever. What they did not know was that I had already spent the last 3 days preparing for this exact moment. They thought the worst outcome was an argument. They were wrong. Before this week ended, they would realize I was no longer a mother who could be manipulated by guilt. 3 days before the U-Haul crushed my hydrangeas, the mail carrier delivered a thick, misdirected envelope. David had always used my address as a permanent backup for his financial accounts, a habit I had repeatedly asked him to break. The envelope was torn at the corner, and as I pulled it from the mailbox, the contents slipped out onto my kitchen counter. I did not go looking for his secrets, but I did not look away when they landed in my home. The papers were a final accounting statement from a high-roller casino host in Las Vegas, bundled with a severe default notice from a private, high-interest lender. I put on my reading glasses, brewed a cup of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen island. I went line by line. The withdrawals, the markers, the desperate loans taken against his own home. I did the math on a yellow notepad. The total was exactly $580,000. My son had gambled away his savings, his property, and his future. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I did not cry. I did not dial his number to scream or ask where I went wrong. I had stopped blaming myself for David's greed a long time ago. Instead, I took action. I drove to the local hardware store and purchased heavy-duty deadbolts for the front and back doors. I changed the code on the garage keypad. I walked through my home, securing every window. David had always treated me like an emergency savings account. Whenever he made a mistake, he expected me to absorb the impact. Sarah encouraged it, viewing my assets as their rightful inheritance, simply waiting to be transferred. I knew exactly what a desperate gambler would do next. He would look for the largest untouched asset he could find: my house. When I finished installing the new locks, I swept the porch. I was ready. Through the narrow opening of the chain door, David stared at me. The rain continued to soak his jacket. "Mom, open the door," he demanded, his tone shifting from confident to irritated. We're restructuring our lives. We need a place to stay. Sarah pushed her way to the front, wedging her shoulder near the gap. Anita, stop being dramatic. We drove 3 hours. It's freezing. Let us inside so we can discuss the arrangements. There are no arrangements, I replied, keeping my posture straight. I'm your son, David snapped, gripping the edge of the door. You have 3 empty bedrooms. You don't even use the upstairs. We just need to stay while we fix a minor business setback. I looked him directly in the eyes. A minor business setback, or 518 $1 in casino markers and defaulted loans. The color drained from David's face entirely. He stepped back as if I had slapped him. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. They had banked everything on the assumption that I was ignorant. They believed they could spin a story about a bad economy, move into my guest room, and slowly drain my resources. You snooped through my mail, David finally accused, trying to pivot the blame toward me. It arrived at my house, torn open, I corrected calmly. You lost your home, David. And now you think you can take mine. Sarah recovered her sharp tongue quickly. He is your flesh and blood. He made a mistake. And you're leaving us in the cold. What kind of mother does that? The kind who refuses to fund a gambling addiction. I answered. I reached down, picked up the damp residency agreement he had shoved beneath the door, and held it up. Take your truck and leave my driveway. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She lunged forward, trying to force her arm through the gap to unhook the chain herself. She deeply underestimated my boundaries. Sarah's hand reached blindly for the metal chain. I didn't raise my voice or panic. I simply grabbed the heavy wooden door and slammed it forward just enough to pinch the space. She yanked her arm back, gasping in shock. Are you crazy? She hissed, massaging her wrist. You do not cross my threshold, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, absolute register. Drop your bags. Turn around. Walk away. David tried to play the peacemaker, raising his hands. Mom, please. We have nowhere else to go. We're broke. Then sleep in the truck. I offered. I closed the door completely until it clicked, slid the deadbolt firmly into place, and walked away. I did not peek through the blinds. I did not pace the living room worrying about their comfort. I walked into my kitchen, and boiled water, and poured myself a cup of chamomile tea. Outside, David pounded on the door a few more times. Sarah yelled something muffled about inheritance and respect. I ignored them. I sat in my favorite armchair, opened a mystery novel, and read for an hour. When I finally went upstairs to bed, I could see the flashing hazard lights of the U-Haul reflecting against the wet asphalt of my driveway. They were stubborn. They genuinely believed that if they waited long enough, my maternal instinct would override my logic. They thought my refusal was a temporary emotional reaction. They didn't understand that my refusal was a permanent policy. I turned off my bedside lamp, pulled the heavy quilt up to my shoulders, and slept deeply. I owed them nothing. The house was quiet, safe, and entirely mine. Tomorrow. I knew they would try a different tactic, but I had a practical solution for that too. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the sky bright and clear. I woke up at my usual time, 6 o'clock, and went to the kitchen to fry bacon and eggs. I opened the kitchen window slightly, letting the rich, savory smell of breakfast drift out toward the driveway. The U-Haul was still parked diagonally across my property, completely blocking my sedan inside the garage. I could see David and Sarah slumped in the front cab, rubbing their stiff necks. They looked miserable. I ate my breakfast slowly, washed my dishes, and dressed in a comfortable sweater and slacks. I unlocked the front door and stepped onto the porch to retrieve my morning newspaper. Hearing the door, David scrambled out of the truck. His clothes were wrinkled, and he looked exhausted. He marched up the walkway, holding the residency agreement that he had retrieved from the porch floor. "Mom, enough is enough," he groaned, rubbing his eyes. "We slept in a truck. Are you happy now? Just sign the paper and let us in." Sarah climbed out of the passenger side, stretching her back with a loud, theatrical groan. She marched over, her hair messy and her patience completely gone. "I need a shower, Anita, and a hot coffee. Open the door right now." I picked up my newspaper, folded it neatly under my arm, and looked at them. The local YMCA has showers for $5. The diner down the street sells coffee for $2. "I'm not going to a YMCA," Sarah snapped. "I live here now." I looked at the document in David's hand. He held it out like a magic wand that could rewrite reality. "Hand me that," I instructed. David's face lit up with a brief, pathetic flash of hope. He thought daylight and discomfort had finally broken me. He handed over the damp, wrinkled contract. I unfolded the paper right there on the porch. The ink was slightly blurred from the rain, but the typed words were entirely legible. It was a template printed from the internet, heavily modified to suit their greed. I read the terms out loud, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet morning street. "The parties agree that David and Sarah Shepard shall establish permanent residency at this address. The master bedroom shall be vacated and turned over to the new residents. The homeowner, Anita Shepard, agrees to maintain all utility payments, property taxes, and grocery expenses while the residents restructure their finances." I looked up. David shifted his weight, suddenly refusing to make eye contact. "You wrote a contract forcing me out of my own bedroom and making me your financial sponsor." I summarized. "I have a sickness." "Mom," David pleaded, pulling the ultimate victim card. "Gambling is an illness. You're supposed to care for me. I just need a stable environment to heal. Moving into my house and spending my pension on your groceries doesn't cure a gambling habit." "David, it just changes the victim." Sarah stepped up, dropping her fake politeness entirely. "You're an old woman. Anita. You don't need 4 bedrooms. You don't need a massive backyard. We lost everything. We deserve the equity in this house. You're going to take out a reverse mortgage, pay off David's debt, and let us live here. That's what families do." There it was. The absolute truth. They didn't just want shelter. They wanted to bleed the walls of my home dry to pay off the bookies and private lenders. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I gripped the top of the residency agreement, pulled my hands in opposite directions, and tore the document cleanly in half. Then I tore it again. I let the wet confetti drop onto the porch. Sarah gasped. David took a step back. "You're going to regret that," Sarah threatened. Sarah glared at the shredded paper on the porch. "You're a selfish, miserable woman," she spat. "We'll just stay right here in the driveway until you lose your mind. We have nowhere else to be. You can't leave your house because the truck is blocking your car. Let's see who starves first." She marched back to the U-Haul, pulled out a long orange extension cord, and walked toward the side of my house. I watched as she plugged it into my outdoor electrical outlet, then connected it to a space heater inside the truck cab. She was setting up camp on my dime. I turned around, went back inside, and locked the door. I walked straight to the utility room in the hallway. I opened the gray metal breaker box on the wall. I found the switch labeled outdoor, garage, patio, and flipped it firmly to the off position. Next, I walked to the basement. I located the main water valve that fed the outdoor garden hoses and tightened it until it wouldn't budge. Finally, I went to my home office, sat at my computer, and logged into my cell phone provider's website. For years, I had kept David and Sarah on my family data plan. It was a minor expense I had ignored out of habit. I clicked on their numbers, selected Remove Line, and hit Confirm. The screen flashed a green check mark. They wanted to wait me out on my property. Fine. But they would do it without my electricity, without my water, and without my cell service. I walked back to the kitchen window and looked out. Sarah was smacking the side of the space heater, wondering why it had suddenly died. David was staring at his phone, repeatedly tapping the screen as the no-service notification appeared. I smiled, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and sat down to read the morning news. By noon, the reality of their situation began to set in. The truck cab was cold without the space heater. They couldn't browse the internet or make calls without hunting for an open Wi-Fi network down the street. I spent the afternoon gardening in the backyard, completely ignoring the massive truck parked out front. I pruned my rose bushes and hummed a quiet tune. Around 3 o'clock, I walked around to the front to collect my mail. Sarah was pacing the driveway, furious. "Turn the power back on," she demanded. "My phone is dead. I can't even call my sister." "You are trespassing," I replied evenly. "I am not required to provide amenities to uninvited guests." David looked pale and jittery. The withdrawal from his chaotic lifestyle, combined with the cold reality of my boundaries, was breaking him down. "Mom, please. Just let us plug in one phone. I need to check my emails. I might have a loan approval coming through." "No," I said. Sarah turned on David, her frustration boiling over. "You told me she was a pushover. You said she'd complain for 10 minutes and then make us dinner. She cut our phones." "David." She shut off the power. "I didn't know she'd do this," David argued, shrinking under his wife's anger. "You're pathetic," Sarah snapped. She marched to the back of the U-Haul, yanked the metal door up, and dragged out a sleek, designer suitcase. She didn't look at me. She didn't look back at David. She simply grabbed her bag, adjusted her coat, and began walking angrily down the sidewalk toward the main road, presumably to find a cafe with Wi-Fi and call a friend. David stood in the driveway, watching his wife abandon him. The alliance they built on the promise of my money crumbled the moment the money was denied. He was entirely alone. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the driveway. David sat on the bumper of the U-Haul, his head buried in his hands. He looked up when he heard the deadbolt click. I stepped onto the porch, holding a small cardboard box. I walked down the steps and set the box on the edge of the driveway, just inches from his boots. He looked inside. It was a collection of his high school track medals, a few old report cards, and a framed photo of him and his father. The last pieces of his childhood that I had kept in the attic. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "This is everything you left here," I said. "It belongs to you. Nothing inside the house belongs to you anymore." Tears finally spilled down his cheeks. He wasn't crying because he felt remorse. He was crying because he had run out of people to manipulate. The people I owe money to. They're not like the bank. "Mom, they're dangerous. If I don't pay them, I don't know what's going to happen to me. You have to take out the equity loan." "You're my mother." I looked at him without an ounce of pity. I had spent decades trying to soften the blows of the world for him, only to realize I was just funding his destruction. Your debt is your problem, David. You gambled away your house. You will not gamble away mine. He stared at me, searching for a crack in my expression, a hint of hesitation. He found nothing. You have until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to move this truck, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. If it is still here, I am turning on the automated sprinkler system, and I will leave it running all day. Enjoy sleeping in the mud. I turned my back on him, walked inside, and locked the door for the night. I woke up at 6 o'clock the next morning to the deep, rumbling sound of a heavy engine turning over. I walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. The U-Haul was backing out of my driveway. David was behind the wheel. He didn't look toward this house. He slowly navigated the heavy truck onto the street and drove away, the taillights fading into the early morning mist. He was finally forced to face his own reflection, his own debts, and his own consequences. I walked outside in my slippers. The heavy tires of the truck had left deep, muddy ruts in my front lawn. I looked at the damage for a moment. It was a mess, but dirt could be leveled, and grass would grow back. A lawn is easy to fix. A ruined life is not. I spent the weekend repairing the yard. I bought fresh topsoil, laid down new grass seed, and planted a border of bright yellow marigolds. 3 months later, my phone pinged with a text message from an unknown number. It was David. Mom. Sarah left me for good. I'm staying on a friend's couch. Can you just send $50 for gas? I read the message while sitting in my backyard, watching the birds gather at the feeder I had built with my late husband. I felt a brief pang in my chest, the ghost of a mother's instinct to fix her child's scraped knee. But David was not a child, and his wounds were entirely self-inflicted. I pressed delete. I blocked the number. I didn't need a lawyer, a dramatic courtroom battle, or a police escort to reclaim my life. I only needed a locked door, a clear mind, and the courage to stop being a victim in my own home. I picked up my watering can, stepped into the sunshine, and tended to my garden. The house was quiet, and it was finally mine alone.